Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're unpacking something absolutely essential and, frankly, overdue for a closer look. The foundational ideas behind bilingual education right here in the United States.
It's a huge topic, really. Touches millions of students' families. And understanding its roots, its history, is so key to grasping what's happening now and why it matters.
Yeah, and you've given us some great material here, excerpts, looks like from maybe an educator's guide. It walks us through the history, the laws, the global scene, and even the real practical steps schools take.
That's right. These aren't just policies on paper. They show the journey, the whole path the U.S. took, shaped by immigration, court cases, all sorts of things.
So our mission for this deep dive, we want to cut through all that, pull out the really crucial bits, the must-knows, and basically give you the insights you need, fast. Think of it as your shortcut.
And we'll dig into how attitudes towards language, diversity, have really shaped opportunities for kids over centuries, and how that still plays out.
Ready. Let's dive in. Okay, so let's kick things off maybe way back. It's easy to think the U.S. was always, mainly English-speaking. But these sources, they paint a totally different picture of early North America.
Oh, completely different. I mean, 16th century, incredibly language diverse, hundreds of indigenous languages. And even when Europeans showed up later, 17th, 18th centuries, English didn't just take over. Not at all.
Right. The source mentions German, Dutch, French, Swedish, Polish, whole communities where these languages were just, normal. And families actually wanted their kids to keep their home languages, even pushed for it in schools. That seems like a part of history we often miss.
It really does flip that English-only narrative, doesn't it? But the sources also make it clear that tolerance wasn't exactly stable. The 19th century. Big changes. Westward expansion, forced assimilation, especially of Native Americans, and that rise in nativism, often tied to anti-immigrant feelings.
So whether people accepted different languages, even in schools, kind of depended on who was arriving and if they seemed like a threat?
Exactly. And that really ramps up in the 20th century. After World War I, there was this huge push, for national unity, which often meant linguistic unity.
Yeah, the source points to that time, like the 1920s up to the 60s, where the expectation for kids who didn't speak English was basically just assimilate, sink or swim.
And a lot of them sank academically. It really sets up that quote highlighted in the material from Gandara and Esmilla about history shifting between tolerance and repression depending on politics, the economy, and the size of the immigrant population.
Wow. That cycle feels incredibly relevant even now. This whole historical back and forth, it really shows why legal action became so necessary, doesn't it?
It absolutely sets the stage for why people started demanding equity through the courts.
Okay, so the legal system steps in. And honestly, this is where it gets really interesting, seeing how the courts tackled this history. The source keeps coming back to the 14th Amendment.
Yes, specifically that equal protection clause, the basic idea that everyone should be treated equally under the law. And in education, that became the foundation to argue that, hey, if kids can't understand the language of instruction, they're not getting an equal education.
And based on that principle, we start seeing these key court cases and laws shaping specific rights. Let's walk through some big ones the source mentions. First up, Mendez v. Westminster.
Right. Now, this one, 1946 in California, wasn't only about language, but it was huge. It challenged segregating Mexican-American kids. The argument was separating them isn't equal. It tapped into those 14th Amendment ideas and hit hard against segregation based on ethnicity, which, often lined up with language.
Then, of course, Brown v. Board of Education. The big one, striking down racial segregation everywhere. Again, not specifically language, but it hammered home that separate but equal was just not equal in schools. Reinforced that idea of equal access.
Exactly. But the case that really hit language head-on was Lau v. Nichols. That went to the Supreme Court in 1974. The ruling was essentially just giving non-English-speaking students the same desks, books, and teachers isn't enough if they can't understand what's going on.
So not providing extra help was basically denying them an education.
That was the core of it. Now, the court didn't say how schools had to fix it, didn't explicitly order bilingual ed, but it made it crystal clear. You have to do something about the language barrier to provide a meaningful education. That was massive.
I bet that sent districts scrambling to figure out what that something should be.
It did. And that leads us to Castaneda v. Pickard. That was a Fifth Circuit case, really important for Texas. It set up this three-part test to see if a district's program for emergent bilinguals was, legally okay. Did it make sense theoretically? Was it actually being implemented properly? And was it working? It gave schools actual criteria.
Okay, so Lau said do something, and Castaneda started defining, how do we know if what we're doing is okay?
That's a good way to summarize it. And one more key one, Plyler v. Doe. Another Supreme Court case. This one established that undocumented immigrant children still have a right to free public education under the 14th Amendment. So immigration status couldn't be used to deny access, including addressing language needs.
It really feels like these legal fights forced the system, which kind of assumed everyone spoke English, to finally grapple with language diversity and figure out how to provide real, equitable access for all kids.
They built the legal framework for the kinds of programs we're talking about today.
Now let's zoom out for a second. The sources touch on the global picture, and it's kind of striking how the U.S. approach, historically anyway, seems different from a lot of other places.
Oh, definitely. You look across Asia, Europe, South America, it's super common, often required, for students to learn second or even third languages in school. Bilingualism, multilingualism, it's not the exception. It's often just normal.
The source mentions the International Institute for Educational Planning, calling multilingual classrooms a growing phenomenon globally, thanks to people moving around more.
And internationally, those language skills are generally seen as a huge plus, a real asset, right? Especially now in this connected world, being able to communicate across cultures and languages is just increasingly vital.
That links directly to that asset-based idea we'll get into later, seeing multilingualism as a strength, not a deficit. Like that example from the London School where kids who already speak other languages are excited to learn more. That really shows a different mindset.
It's a really powerful contrast to some of those historical swings towards repression we saw in the U.S.
Okay, let's get practical. We have these legal requirements, this goal of equity. How does the system, drawing from the Texas example in the source, actually identify and serve these students? This is where the LPAC comes in the Language Proficiency Assessment Committee.
Yeah, the LPAC is basically the operational heart of it all, set up specifically because of those legal mandates to make sure kids get the right services.
And its legal footing is solid Texas Admin Code, Federal Title III. Its main job, review all the info on students who might need support right when they enroll, and then check in every year.
And the whole thing kicks off right at registration with the Home Language Survey, the HLS. The source flags those two critical questions. What language is used in the child's home most of the time? And what language does the child use most of the time?
And here's the key bit. Any answer besides English to either question. That's the trigger. Starts the clock ticking. Districts have just 4 weeks to assess the student and figure out placement.
Right. The HLS flags them. Then they get tested for English proficiency using the LAS assessments. Which specific test depends on their age.
For the little ones, pre-K3, pre-K4, kindergarten, it's the pre-LAS, just oral language, listening and speaking.
Then for first grade, LAS links, still listening, speaking, but a bit more advanced. And for grades 2 through 12, LAS links covers all 4, listening, speaking, reading, and writing.
And eligibility basically comes down to performance on those tests. Scoring at level 1, 2, or 3 generally means you're classified as an emergent bilingual, or EB.
That's it. And sometimes, for younger kids in bilingual programs, they might also do primary language testing to see what skills they have there. Getting out of EB status, reclassification, that depends on showing proficiency on state tests, linked to TELPAS, the Texas English Language Proficiency Assessment System, using these things called proficiency level descriptors, or PLDs.
PLDs. Those sound like the detailed guides for what kids should actually be able to do with English at each stage.
Yeah.
Beginning, intermediate, advanced high, across listening, speaking, reading, writing.
Precisely. It's a whole structured, legally defined process. Identify, assess, serve based on proficiency.
Okay, so a student's identified. What's the actual point of the program they end up in?
Yeah.
What's the philosophy behind it? The source really hammers home this idea of creating an additive program.
Yes, and this is so important. It's the direct opposite of that historical assimilation push we talked about. Assimilation here means, melting into the dominant culture and language, often meaning you lose your first one.
Right, like trading your home language for English.
Exactly. Acculturation is a bit different, adapting, borrowing traits, but keeping your own culture too. More of a blend. But additive programs aim for something even richer, fostering a bicultural identity.
Bicultural. meaning you identify with and feel part of two distinct cultures.
Right. Instead of seeing the student's first language and culture as problems to be erased, additive programs view them as assets, things to build on, to reinforce, while also adding English and familiarity with U.S. culture. There's a quote in there from Colthane making the point that learning a language isn't just words, it's cultural and linguistic competence, because language lives inside culture.
So the goal isn't just learning English. It's adding English without subtracting who the student already is, linguistically and culturally.
It's about growing, enriching, not replacing.
Okay, so if that's the additive philosophy, how does it actually play out? The source details these state-approved program models in TExES.
Right. These are the structures schools use. They have to be part of the main school program focused on fair participation and developing both English skills and academic skills.
And there are 4 main bilingual models listed. Let's break them down. First, the transitional bilingual models. There's an early exit and a late exit.
Okay, so these typically serve only emergent bilingual students. They use the student's home language, their L1, to teach academics while the student is learning English, the main goal. English proficiency and catching up academically. Early exit aims to get them into English-only classes pretty fast, usually 2 to 5 years. Late exit gives more L1 support, longer, aiming for maybe 6 or 7 years.
So in transitional models, the first language is kind of like a temporary bridge to English?
That's the basic idea. Now compare that to the dual language immersion models. There's one way and two way.
And the source is clear, the goal here is different.
Totally different. The goal for dual language is full biliteracy. That means being really proficient, reading and writing well in both languages. One-way immersion serves only emergent bilingual students, like the transitional models, but two-way immersion. That mixes emergent bilinguals with native English speakers who also want to become bilingual.
Ah, okay. So two-way integrates different language groups, while one-way and transitional are just for the emergent bilingual kids.
Exactly. And crucially, in dual language, instruction in both languages continues throughout the program. Often at least half the day is in the partner language. They also target reclassification around year 6 or 7, but the main aim is lasting bilingualism and biliteracy for everyone involved.
And the source notes teachers need specific bilingual certification for these. Understanding these models seems key. They really have different aims and outcomes.
They really map out different educational journeys for students.
So the million-dollar question, do they work? What's the research say about how effective these programs actually are?
Well, the research summarized in the source is pretty positive, actually. It suggests that both transitional bilingual ed and dual language immersion programs do help students learn and help close achievement gaps.
And the why seems to be because students can learn challenging stuff in their first language while they're still picking up English, so they don't fall behind academically. Their L1 helps them learn.
Exactly. They can show what they know, tackle tough coursework. The research finds kids in these programs learn and use both languages effectively. But here's a really important finding the source highlights. Those dual language two-way models. They seem to be more effective in the long run than the transitional models.
That's pretty significant. If the goal is long-term success, full potential. Dual language looks like it has the edge.
It really seems so. And the source even mentions that older research, Collier and Thomas, back in '97, finding that bilingual students can actually end up outperforming monolingual peers on tests over time.
That seriously reinforces that whole asset idea, right? Bilingualism, when it's supported the right way, isn't just about getting students caught up. It can actually lead to better outcomes for everyone.
Yeah, it develops complex skills that benefit the student, the school, the whole community, really.
Okay, bringing this right down to the classroom. How does a teacher actually do this stuff, implement these models? The source stresses that teachers really need to get the models to make the right teaching choices.
Absolutely. Your teaching has to match the program's goals. The material lists examples like using specific content and language objectives for lessons, making sure instruction hits those cross-curricular student expectations, using performance-based activities so kids can show learning in different ways, and using tools like the TELPAS descriptors and the LIA, that's the Linguistic Instructional Alignment Guide.
Those sound like tools for really intentionally supporting learning, making sure kids get the subject matter and the language they need for it. Scaffolding.
Exactly. But beyond the how you teach, the actual environment you create, that might be just as important, maybe even more so.
Right. The source talks about creating an effective bilingual and multicultural learning environment. What does that really mean day to day for a teacher?
It means things like being genuinely sensitive to different cultural backgrounds, different experiences with acculturation, showing respect for regional language variations, dialects, and really actively bringing the students' home culture and language, their funds of knowledge, into the classroom, making it part of learning.
So connecting home and school isn't just a nice to have, it's actually core to teaching these kids well.
It really is. There's that great quote from Gay in there about needing knowledge that's beyond mere awareness to really use cultural diversity effectively. The TEA guidance echoes this. Value home resources, see them as foundations, build on them, understand learning is cultural, recognize language demands, see how identity affects achievement, differentiate fairly.
It keeps coming back to that additive idea. Value what the student brings, build from there.
It's all about growing their whole linguistic toolkit, not swapping parts out.
And finally, let's loop all the way back. The Texas Admin Code says these programs have to address students' affective, linguistic, and cognitive needs. We've hit linguistic and cognitive language, academics. What about the affective needs? What does that involve?
Affective is all about the emotional side, well-being, confidence, identity. So meeting those needs in a safe, caring classroom means actively fostering bilingualism, biliteracy, biculturalism as good things. It means having books and materials that reflect and celebrate the students' cultures and languages.
Building their self-confidence, that positive identity.
Absolutely. Using high-quality materials that are culturally sustaining, including lessons that help all kids appreciate diversity, develop sociocultural awareness, and doing all this alongside strong instruction in core subjects in both languages when needed, with high expectations for everyone.
So it's not just about the mechanics of language or content. It's deeply tied to how students feel about themselves and whether they feel they belong.
Exactly right. That Collier and Thomas quote against sociocultural stuff is the emotional heart of school. It can either open doors to learning or slam them shut. Creating that socioculturally supportive environment is just fundamental for emergent bilinguals to really succeed. Things like the International Children's Library are practical ways teachers can foster that.
Wow. Okay. That really ties it all together. We've gone from this surprisingly multilingual history through repression, legal fights for equity, a look at the global norm, the nuts and bolts of identifying kids and the program models, and finally landed on how vital it is to value identity and build a supportive space that addresses the whole student.
Yeah, it's clear that doing bilingual education well isn't simple. It's this complex mix of history, law, research, program design, teaching strategies, and maybe most importantly, creating that environment where kids feel culturally and linguistically valued and safe.
So here's something to chew on as we wrap up. We heard the research suggests models like two-way dual language immersion often have better long-term outcomes than transitional ones. So why might those less effective models still be so common in some places? What historical baggage, political pressures, or just practical hurdles keep them in place? And how could understanding all these foundations we discussed help people advocate for wider use of the programs that research shows work best?
Thinking through those real-world barriers. That really connects this foundational knowledge to the ongoing work, doesn't it? The work of making sure every student gets an equitable shot.
That's all for this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful.